The Ricardo Leong Center for Chinese Studies really started with a book called Heroic Leadership. Chris Lowney in that book talked about the Jesuits in China, how Matteo Ricci and his companions were able to introduce Western culture to China through a spirit of innovation and openness. Dr. Rosita Leong read that book and was very inspired. Her husband is Ricardo Leong, who is an Ateneo alumnus. So then they had the idea of setting up some kind of center in the Philippines where we can train young Filipinos, especially Ateneans, to understand China. That is how the idea of establishing a center came about. For the longest time, we have a public event, the Spring Film Festival, which is a way to promote Chinese culture and language by way of a popular medium, and that's films. It's a soft way of learning about a country's language and culture. And to keep that going for 10 years, I think is really quite an accomplishment. We need to understand China in a better way and in a deeper way. And that's why it's important to do it in the academe. There's support for conferences, for research, for scholarships, and that's what the Leong Center is trying to do on different levels.
At the time, I think Celadon was a bit of a crossroads. So it was always known as the Phil Chai org. It was sort of trying to grow out of that. And remember, around 1997, these were times when kidnapping was an issue, the big Phil Chai issue of that decade. But still people are saying, trying to fit in. We don't really think there's a gap. We think it's really shrinking to the point that you don't notice it anymore. People still made the joke, yeah, your parents will force you to join this org so you can find a way. It was a smaller org, meaning it just didn't have the number of activities that you have now. You have much more people, much more projects right now.
If you were to describe Celadon in one word, what would it be?
Home.
A home. A home within a home within a home.
Everyone here is so nice. Like, all of you guys, you just want to see each other win. It's a real team effort. It's beautiful. Here in Celadon, it feels like everything is so personal to the people that are running the projects.
Celadon gave me the stepping stone to become a bigger person, to become more kind to people, to become more open. Same time, it trained me to become more of a leader. I learned to become more sociable and more accepting of the different people that we meet. Because every year we meet new members, we meet new people.
For the past 5 years, I saw members, their reason gets deeper and deeper. When I was a fresh, I joined because I had friends from the upper classes. But now, I think you kind of see a deeper reason now. Parang, because I saw this project last year, I really wanted to learn about Chinese-Filipino culture. Ganun.
I wish that Celadon just continues to grow, man. We're a big community, and I just want all of us to keep growing, to keep falling in love with what we do, and more people get to see the beauty that comes with being a Celadonian.
Yeah, what I really just wish for the org is that the values that make up the core part of our identity always stays there. That no matter what we do, how much we scale, how much we grow, we still remember how important it is that values that are central to the org, people-oriented values that don't emphasize over the years. They don't get tossed to the side.
I think it's very important. Like I spent a lot of my time outside the classroom with Celadon, right? And I think that's still true for all of you. It's definitely a key part of the Ateneo experience for all of us. Right now, social media is at a point where something that happens with, say, Ateneo or UP gets reported nationally, especially now where, say, political statements, all the orgs, not just Celadon, get together. So you can do a lot of things.
I hope that Celadon gets to reach more people because I think that there are a lot of people out there who want to experience Chinese Filipino culture. I hope that Celadon gets to share how we celebrate the culture with them.
Astig.ph.
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 To astig.ph.
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 Astig.ph. Astig.ph.
Astig.ph.
Salamat. Visit Astig.ph.
Got something you want to share to the world? We got you, fam! We are looking for awesome people like you who want to share content that deserve a spotlight on our site. Whether it's a list of everything you love about catos and doggos, pop culture related artworks, or even your own random photos, memes, and funny videos, we'd be happy to see it and share it to the world. Join our award-winning team and be part of our Ink Pop creator community.
Hey, it's me, Guyito. Want to become a writer, artist, or photographer when you grow up? Test your creative skills with us. We're looking for kids aged 7 to 12 years old with unpublished work like articles, short stories, poems, essays, artworks, videos, and others. Join our award-winning team and be a part of our Kinderpop contributors and get your awesome work published for the entire world to see. Send in your work to pop@inquirer.net or visit facebook.com/inkpop to know more. Now let's show them how kids get it done.
we begin our talk, we would like to take the time to give our utmost gratitude to the following. Ateneo de Manila University, Ateneo Celadon, Ateneo Ricardo Leong Center for Chinese Studies, Chinatown Museum, Asian Dragon Magazine, Rich Prime Global Incorporated, Exo Manufacturing Corporation, Barefoot, and Blue Hangook Society. This event would also not be possible without our online media partners, Chinoy TV, Astig PH, SparkUp, and The Inquirer. We would also like to thank the Loyola School's Campus Events Management Team and Chinatown Museum for making this simultaneous live streaming possible on Facebook and also on YouTube. Also, a special shout out to the Ateneo Ricardo Leong Center for Chinese Studies for providing scholarships for numerous applicants and making this event an absolute reality. Again, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for partnering with us for this spring festival event. Everything that we have so far has definitely showcased the uniqueness of our culture. And now I think it's about time that we delve into the diverse yet rich culture of traditional foot binding. Here to present today's talk entitled The History, Practice, and Discourse of the Lotus Feet Tradition, we have Dr. Stuart Young. Dr. Stuart Young is a professional who is extremely knowledgeable about cultural and historical topics. He is currently a faculty member at the Department of History and Chinese Studies program at the Ateneo de Manila University. He is a Philippine-born Chinese who was raised and educated in the United States. We truly have a wonderful gem of a speaker here today. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to offer our virtual round of applause for Dr. Stuart Young.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our live stream. I'm glad to be with you. And I'm here to share with you a very interesting topic that perhaps you may have heard of, and you may even know somebody who knew somebody who once had a relative with this tradition. So without further ado, I'd like to dive right into our presentation today. And we'd like to ask the question, what is the Lotus Feet tradition? Now, the title is intended to kind of reveal at the same time conceal something. So some of you out there are probably wondering, what in the world is a lotus feet? Well, simply put, the idea of a lotus feet is a Chinese practice that was done for almost 1,000 years, and if perhaps even longer. And we'd like to talk about this tradition. This has a lot to do with keeping a woman's feet small. So when you see in this picture here, you see an illustration of a child, a Chinese child, and a grown woman from the Qing dynasty or the later Qing dynasty in China. And you have a very interesting comparison. Not only the size, but you also see the size of the shoe. Notice, proportionally speaking, the woman's shoe is relatively small. And that's what this whole tradition is about. It's about keeping one's feet small as possible, because it is considered to be a very prestigious thing. It's considered to be something that is very sensual for a lot of people. And during this time, this was kind of like the thing to do. Now, why did they call it the lotus feet? Well, the feet, the objective of the feet is to fit into these lotus shoes. Now, these lotus shoes comes in many shapes and sizes, but they all have one thing in common. They're very small. And the ideal size for this is 3-inch. That's what they call the golden standard, the golden lotus. So with all these fancy designs and so on, it is to house a basically deformed shoe, feet rather. So when you see this old picture here of, well, actually it's not that old. It's one of the last living members in China with this practice. You see that the feet is distorted in such a way where it can cram into that very, very tiny shoe. All right, so today, you're probably wondering, why do people go through such length to do that, to deform themselves? So in today's lecture, I like to kind of cover three things. The first is the history. We'd like to talk about when this tradition come from. How did it start? How did people get into this practice? And how did this change over time? We know that China has a very long history, and through the 1,000 years, different empires, different dynasties have come and gone. And how did it develop? Then we also like to look at the practice. How is this done? So what do you have to do to attain this standard? And what were the risks involved? All right, so doing this kind of practice involves risks as well. Then you also have the discourse behind it. All right, I think in later periods, people, when we begin to look at this, we start to wonder why. All right, because we don't live in the ancient days, and of course, people in our day, when we look at this practice, it kind of strikes us as odd or peculiar. But when we look at this, why was it so appealing to the people? We like to look into that, and what are some possible motivations behind that? And then why do the women have to undergo through this process? Did they have a choice? Why did they have to endure this rather painful process to kind of keep their feet like really tiny? You know, in a way, it's kind of like, it reminds me of a bonsai tree. You know, the objective in doing a bonsai is to keep it very miniature and small, and to be crammed in a little bowl or a little pot. And essentially, that's what they're trying to do with a woman's feet, is to try to keep it miniature. So it's a very painful process. And why did this continue for so long in China? So these are some of the questions we like to tackle today, as I hope that you would hang with me today and fasten your seatbelt. We're going to cover a lot of things today. Now let's go on. Let's talk about the beginnings. We have to go all the way back to the Shang Dynasty, because there's a lot of stories and well, actually two major stories that is circulating. When you look at the origins of this practice of the lotus feet. Now, everything in the early days of China, you know, the Chinese always brag, being a Chinese, we're the people of the Middle Kingdom. We like to brag and tell people that we have a very long civilization. It goes back 5,000 years, right? And well, a lot of that is partly true, but a lot of it is not really historically accounted for, because when we trace it all the way back, historically speaking, some of the stories and legends and myths are really in that form. It's done through oral tradition. It's recorded in that way. So it's really hard to have any concrete evidence of what actually took place. Although there are people who are digging and discovering new things all the time. But we trace it back to the Shang Dynasty, because this is one of the earliest historically documented period that we would consider to be the beginning, the civilization in China. Well, it all started with, in terms of this whole idea of the bound feet. There was a story and a legend about a certain Shang princess, all right, one of the royalty during this time, who was born with a club feet. Now, when you look at this illustration on the top, you can see it is a physical deformity. It's a congenital condition that certain people are born with and inflicted with, that instead of having a flat feet, the feet is distorted, it's twisted, it's kind of like mangled in a sense. And the story was that there was this legendary princess, empress, who had that. And because of that, she felt that she was very insecure. And because of her being in that position of power, she demanded everybody within the royal courts to have their foot bound. Now, it's really hard for us to substantiate this, and this is in the realm of legends, but many people would point to this and say this is the inspiration, perhaps, or the early beginnings of this. Now, there's another variant story that is involving a Shang princess as well. This has to do with the fox spirit, the legendary fox spirit, which is well known in China and many other Asian civilizations, where a certain vixen or the spirit symbolized by the fox can transform itself into a very enticing and beautiful woman. And in this particular story, there was a Shang princess by the name of Daji, and she was the one who was attributed in Chinese history as the temptress who eventually brought down a very wicked king, which pretty much ended the Shang dynasty. So anyway, given the fact that she's a controversial figure, they would attribute that to the fox spirit who enticed the king to bring down the empire. And how does that have to do with bound feet? Well, the legend goes that this fox spirit tried to conceal his paws by hiding clothes. So it kind of wrapped itself because the fox couldn't transform itself into a complete woman. So they had to kind of bound the hands and the feet and so on. So in a sense, this kind of served as the early sources and legendary sources that would often be pointed to as the inspiration behind this bound feet tradition. Now, moving ahead, when we look at some more concrete stories, people would attribute this to a more historical beginning during the 5 Dynasty and 10 Kingdoms period. Now, we have to remember that during China at this time, it's not very clear-cut. When we talk about dynasties, especially during this time, there are many warring factions. You have many different groups vying for power, families, clans, and so forth. And during the fall of the Tang Dynasty, you have many different kingdoms coming, and eventually they all came and went, and eventually what came during this period was the Song Dynasty. It was during the early period of the Song Dynasty, within the period of the 5 Dynasty and 10 Kingdom period, where there was a certain emperor by the name of Liu. Okay, and this guy was a very powerful king, and you want to be entertained on one occasion. So he had this concubine, one of his favorite concubines, by the name of Yao Niang, to do a dance. And this particular concubine was his favorite because she had really tiny feet. So the king, the emperor, made this really small lotus-shaped stage for her to dance. And because of her daintiness and how she was able to tiptoes and move so lightly on this platform, that the king was so amazed by this, so greatly delighted by this, that eventually he ordered all the courtesans and all the court dancers to have bound feet because he just liked women like that. Right, so you have this tradition of the lotus feet came as a result of this incident right here, this infamous dance, if you will. Now, why the lotus feet? Well, somehow it is kind of associated with the lotus flower and the lotus blossom in which this woman danced. And when you look at a lotus bud, it's very delicate, it's very close and very tight. And the shape of it reminds the people that we need to do our feet like that, right? So that somehow the connection between the lotus tradition and bound feet came about. In terms of the Song Dynasty, this tradition eventually spread to different sectors of society. The idea of small feet became really fashionable. It was something that people kind of gravitated toward. It became very popular in the higher elite among the gentry class. So eventually this was practiced by a few powerful families, and eventually this kind of spread to the upper class. People all wanted to be like the upper class, so they tried to emulate and to copy that. And in time, this kind of trickled down to the rural community, the poor, and everybody tried to get in on the action. But this is, by and large, very few in terms of the rural practice of this tradition. So during the early days, you have this beginnings. We start to see evidences of this practice coming to light at this time. Now, during the next dynasty, when the Song fell, the Yuans take over. Now, the Yun dynasty is very interesting because this is a dynasty that was founded by Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan was a Mongol. He was one of the fierce warriors and a grandson, I believe, of Genghis Khan. They were able to conquer a large piece of territory that expands to the Middle East. Now, at this time, Kublai Khan was able to invade China during this period and was able to establish a Mongol rule. Now, the Mongols were ethnically very different from the Chinese. They're from the northern tribes. And the Chinese, the traditional Han Chinese from the previous dynasties, were overpowered by them. And when the Chinese were under the reign of the Mongols, many Chinese continued to practice this practice, and the Mongol were able to embrace a lot of the Chinese customs. Now, remember that the Chinese have been around for a long time. They have a lot of refined traditions that the Mongols did not have. Therefore, the Mongols were very impressed by a lot of these traditions, and they embraced a lot of these customs. But it's very interesting that they never embraced foot binding. Now, this is one thing that didn't really appeal to the Mongols because they saw that this was kind of very odd. Why distort the feet? And for them, the Mongols were just not sold on this idea. And we don't see a lot of Mongols doing this. And during this time, Mongols did not emphasize this. This is ironic. This is very interesting because during this time of the Yuan dynasty was the time when Marco Polo and some other Western travelers went to China. They were able to meet with the Mongol rulers and even served in the Mongol court. And in their accounts, they didn't really mention about foot binding. All right, so it goes to show that this was not in vogue and practice among the elite, among the ruling class of China. However, the Han Chinese, the indigenous Chinese from that region, from the previous dynasties, continued this tradition, and they practiced it secretly in their own, and it was not in the courts. Now, as the Mongols departed and they waned in their power, the Ming dynasty was established. Now, during this time, it was the return of the Hans, the ethnic Chinese were able to come back. They were able to retake China. And during this time, expectedly, this tradition of foot binding became very well established. It made a comeback. It became mainstream. So when we look at this period, a scholar by the name of Cole suggests that this was a period that foot binding and the Han identity became synonymous. So this practice of tying the feet and making it very small, like the women's feet has to be very dainty and small, became the trademark of the Han Chinese identity. And she even goes as far as saying that this is defined by, if one is a Han Chinese, then this is the thing that they do. So we can see that during the Ming Dynasty, it was a period where this practice of foot binding became very prominent and established. Then you also have another scholar by the name of Berger in 2019. She studied the tombs from this period and earlier. She suggests that this practice represents the ideal of womanhood, in a sense, for a lot of the elite classes in China. So this is the thing to do. If you're a woman in the upper class, you have to do this because it's part of your identity, right? So this is became a very big and powerful theme at this time. Now, as the Qing dynasty came into power, we're moving ahead. There's so many dynasties to talk about. The Manchu dynasty. Now, this is another dynasty that came in. This is a foreign tribe, and this is from Manchuria, and once again was able to uproot the Han dynasty, the ethnic Han people. And despite the fact that they were able to gain the political power, foot binding was firmly established by the Hans already. Now, during this time, it was very much practiced by the native Chinese, the Han Chinese, but the Manchu women did not practice it, just like the Mongols, right? Somehow, in time, they were able to admire the daintiness of this and how the women, the Han Chinese women walked. But they didn't want to go through the suffering. So you know what they did? They were very, very smart about this. In order to kind of emulate the charm of the Chinese and the delicate way in how the Chinese women with bound feet walk, the Manchus would just come up with their own designs to kind of emulate that. In a way, this is kind of like a cheat, right? You have the regular shoes with little pedestal, and when you cover it with the long dress, it looks like you're walking like you had bound feet, but in actual reality, it's like you have like your regular feet, right? So there's kind of like a boat shoe on stilts in a way. So this kind of gives the effect that you're going through the pains just to achieve this beauty, this sort of daintiness, but without having to go to the pain. So somehow they found a way around this tradition. Now we see that one of the latest and one of the last royals, a very controversial and powerful figure by the name of the Empress Dowager in Chinese history, Cixi. All right, we see that she also wears this tradition. Now, when she came into power, she did not have bound feet, but she respected that tradition in a way, but she, without having to go through the trouble. So we can see a picture of her in her older days wearing one of these type of shoes. Right? So it also has very long fingernails. Okay, so very interesting. But by the end of the night, reaches apex. Right. So historically speaking, this practice of having tiny feet. So when you look at these photographs, these vintage photographs of women from that period, you can see that their feet is pointy, although they look kind of trendy, all right? When you look at their clothing and so on, and especially in this particular picture, we can see that during this Manchurian Qing dynasty, the last dynasty of the China, imperial dynasties in China, you see that the women, a lot of women still fashion this tradition, right? So this is a very widespread thing. Now, I have to make mention of the fact that most of the Han upper class women had this practice, except for the Hakkas. Now, the Hakkas is ethnically Han, but then they're very different. They have their own unique culture, and we don't have time to go into that, but they did not look at this as a very good thing to do. All right, so somehow they never really mind it. They don't think that it's natural, and they had kind of stuck to their own ways. They're a very unique bunch who is the exception to the rule. Now, by this time, one writer, and there are several other writers who also confirmed this data here, says by this guy writing in 1993, he says that by the waning years of the Qing dynasty, or the last dynasty, the Manchu dynasty, which is between 1890s and 1900s, 40 to 50% of all women had bound feet in China. All right, so that's quite a substantial amount of people, if you think about it. Now, you might wonder, okay, so what about the other 50% or the other 60% who didn't have bound feet? Well, we have to remember that the people who had bound feet had the means to do so. Now, China is traditionally an agricultural society, so the people who are poor, people in the rural areas have to work out in the field, it's not practical to have these kind of things. So they did not practice this. But for the people with means, and especially for the women of the upper class or people with, more resources and so forth, they would do these kinds of things. Or sometimes even within a family, perhaps the most beautiful, the most promising child, girl, will undergo this process while the rest will not because of practical reasons, economics, right? But it goes to show that 100% of the women of the upper class had bound feet, right? So this is a fact that is very much associated with class. With this period emerging, now we have to remember that during the Qing dynasty, toward the final period of the Qing dynasty, a lot of things happened in China. Eventually, it became very weak, and you began to have a lot of Western influences coming in to China. Imperialism and British imperialism, they have their colonies and they have their trading houses in China. They were able to kind of cause a lot of change. Now, during this time in the late 1800s, there's also a lot of travel, a lot of movement. So a lot of different ideas came into the picture, right? So somehow China is no longer the same because you start to have all these ideas coming in. You start to have this anti-foot binding initiative during the Qing period, the later Qing period. Now, it came from basically two sides, one from within China. Now, with the indigenous movements who were against this tradition, were pretty much the leaders of the Taiping Rebellion. Now, we have to remember that this should be 1850 to 1864, okay? There was this rebellion of this group known as the Taiping Rebellion. They have a very interesting story. Their origin is Hakka. Now, keep in mind that the Hakkas are not into foot binding. So again, given the fact that their Hakka origin, it adds to this idea. When they attain power, they discourage this practice. They try to teach against this. And also, given the fact that Taiping leaders were very much influenced by radical Christian millenarian doctrines and ideas. So somehow they were influenced by the West, the missionaries who came, and they were able to kind of, mix different ideas and have this very syncretic way to look at China from the light of the Bible, in a way, and somehow come up with this idea that they have to liberate the country from the clutches of the imperial power, and hence they rebel against the authority. Now, under this very brief period, under the Taiping rulers within the Qing dynasty, you have this movement, a pushback against this tradition of foot binding. Aside from this, other local Chinese humanistic thinkers, such as these people mentioned here, you see their pictures here, and including a woman, a feminist, you start to see their work begin to kind of be influenced by the work. Now, a lot of these individuals were exposed to Western ideas. Some of them even went to study abroad, right? So without having to go into a lot of details regarding what each one of them did, they came back with different ideas and it started to reform and campaign against this practice that they considered to be very inhumane and very barbaric. Then you also have the Western influence, right? And you start to have this influence from the people, the missionaries, expectedly. And also this woman by the name of Alicia Little, and among her circles, she was a very influential figure, a British writer who wrote a lot of books and became a very spokesperson against this idea of foot binding. Right? So you have a lot of pushback in this practice as the Westerners came in and they brought new ideas. And at this time, it was known as a very, very, how should we say, enlightened period in a sense. You see this in different movements around the world and different way of thinking. So it's kind of like challenging the traditions of China. As the Chinese Qing dynasty fell in 1911, 1912, the Republicans came into power. Now, this is the group led by Sun Yat-sen, okay? They came into power and they were very much influenced by the West. Now, a lot of the founders of the nationalist movement and also the Republicans who came into power at this time, who was pretty much the ruler of China with this new republic that they're able to find in China, were very Western educated. Sun Yat-sen, for example, he was educated in the West. He spent a lot of years in Hawaii and learned from Christians in a Christian school and so forth. And he was able to bring a lot of ideas, and a lot of the intellectuals who founded the movement with him were very much against this very backward practice, they call it. So they kind of officially outlawed this practice that's been going on for like 1,000 years. And they tried to enforce this. Now, we have to remember that during this time, there was a lot of tension, a lot of struggles going on. You have the warlords in the north. You also have the coming of the Japanese a little bit later. And you're also fighting the other side, the communists. So despite all those things going on, there's just so much happening there. In 1915, they began to enforce this practice. They started to send out inspectors to make sure that, especially in the cities, people do not practice this, and they would give them tax incentives and have financial incentives for doing this, and also very steep penalties if they were caught doing this practice, this foot binding practice. So somehow it proved to be successful to a certain extent, but as usual, old habits die hard, old traditions, it's just not going to go away really quickly. And eventually, the practice continued to wane, right? However, the remnant of this practice continued in the provinces and in the rural areas. We start to see, more of the rural areas embracing this. And they often would practice in secret just to avoid getting caught. Okay, so you still have a remnant of this practice happening. In 1949, when Mao Zedong took over and defeated the nationalists fled to Taiwan, while the communists were able to seize power. And of course, the communist regime was very against this idea of foot binding. And they were really serious about stamping this out. They considered this practice to be very inhumane, and they also consider this to be inconsistent with their Maoist ideas. Okay, so the Maoist government really put an end to this practice. So according to Cole, he said the last case reported of a girl having bound feet was 1957, right? So that was supposed to be the last person that they know of, right? I don't know if this is still practiced in somewhere else, but eventually this whole tradition of the lotus feet died out, right? So according to some other studies that were done and confirmed later on, it is estimated that from the period between 950 BC, now this is the Song dynasty, and 1949, when the communists came into power in China, over 2 billion women had their feet bound. Can you imagine that? 2 billion women had their feet bound. Right? That's a lot of women. And it's really amazing that, so many people had to undergo this process. Now, as we see the pictures of these women, these young women with bound feet, notice their feet is pointy, and you start to see them showing off their fashion and their shoes and so forth. This is the last generation. And eventually, they died out, right? So there was this photographer and this journalist by the name of Joe Farrell who went to China and was able to document a lot of the last few women who had this bound feet tradition. And in some of the photos, it's very moving when you look at these women, and somehow in their older years, they show their bound feet, right? And you see how distorted they are, and they talk about the discomfort that they feel. They talk about, how it impacted them later in life, what the price to pay for beauty. And not only that, but they also talk about the process and the pains that they have to go through to achieve these things. So this is the last generation that you see. right? Now, we just spent a lot of time talking about the history. I know some of you are probably like, oh, okay, enough of history. We'd like to take a break, all right? We'd like to go to our co-host right now and ask you to take a poll, all right? So can we pause for like a few seconds and have our guest, our host, Alicia, to come and take a poll, and we'll just pick up from here. We'll continue to talk about the practice.
Thank you. All right, guys. So right now you may address all your questions. Actually, the poll, we have a poll right now in our Facebook Live as well. For those watching on YouTube, you can try to comment on our Facebook Live right now, maybe in the Leong Center one, or yes, on the Shinoy TV one. And we'll get back to the poll results in a few. So yes, Dr. Stewart, I will be revealing the results later on at the end of your talk, so you may now continue. Thank you.
All right. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Alicia, for that. All right, now we'll go back to the lecture. All right. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to go quickly right now. Okay, the history is a little bit long. We're going to go through quickly now. Okay, the practice and the procedure of foot binding. How do you do that? Right? How do you do the foot binding thing? Well, the process usually begins when the girl is very young. Right? It has to start young, because once your bones are hardened and you pass a certain age, it's going to be like virtually impossible and super painful to do this kind of thing. So usually the median age is between 4 and 9, although some people would go as early as 2 years to 12 years old to do this. Of course, the older you are, the more difficult the process will be. And this is a very, very painful one where the kids do not have a choice. It's really very sad that they don't have a choice. And the one who carries this out is either a relative or the parent themselves or a professional foot binder. All right. Obviously, there's a market for this kind of thing. And you have these people would come in and do this job for you. It's a continuous process that goes on for years. Now, the process will begin by soaking the feet. Now, the feet would kind of be soaked in water infused with different kind of Chinese herbs, and sometimes you have other ingredients like mixing with blood and so forth, and you have your own family recipe, and depending on the territory and different provinces and so forth. And the job here is to basically clean it and to soften the feet for the process. Then they would trim the nails so that the nails would not cut the bent part and it would not cause infection, because infection is always a risk here. Then you also have a lot of different variants of this. Now, again, Berger would talk about that in the earlier days. The idea is to make it sharp and pointy with the big toes up. But later on, you start to see in the Ming and Qing periods that the goal in making this feet as small as possible became their thing, right? They wanted to kind of make it small, whatever it takes. Now, it really depends on which region and what your preference is. There's no one way to do this. But the most desired standard is 3 inches. Okay, they would say that this is the golden lotus, this is the ideal. Now, if you can't make 3 inches, then okay, 4 is not bad. They consider this to be the lotus, silver lotus. Then the 5-inch foot, it's still quite small. They would say that this is an inferior quality in a sense. It's the iron lotus, right? So the smaller the better, and that's basically the rule. The practice involves 2 very painful folds. The first one has to do with the folding down of the toes toward the ball of the feet. So basically, the toe would be kind of like bent down, and the little toes would often be broken, right? So in order to kind of shape it in, you need to kind of squeeze the thing until it cracks and breaks. And the second portion is to put the heels up toward the front of your feet, the ball of your feet. Okay, so this is a very elaborate process, very painful. And once the shape is formed, then they would tie it very tightly with strips of cloth, sometimes with silk. And this will be fastened, it would be sewn on. This will be done in such a way where the girl would not be able to remove it, because when you remove it, it defeats the purpose. So the idea is to kind of squeeze it and cram it in. Now, eventually what happens is that the girl will complain a lot. Obviously, it's very painful. You're basically breaking your leg and forcing it into a mold in a sense, and it's a process that has to be repeated. They have to periodically take it off and clean it, and if there's infection, they need to check it, because health implications is a very big concern here, right? So the risk of it bleeding in the process is always there. Infection is always present. So they have to kind of remove the bandages. Oftentimes the bandages will be soaked with blood because, obviously you start to have a lot of, pressure mounting, and especially with how tight they tie the feet. And as the child grows, it becomes some very painful process that in time, if they do it long enough, they become numb. And sometimes when you're numb, it's a very big concern because they can't really know if it's being infected or not. So regular cleaning is a must. They have to kind of go into this cleaning thing and routinely clean it. Now, for the rich people, they can do it every day. They can hire people to clean it, like in this woman's case. And for the poor, they don't do it so often because it's an elaborate process. Because the bandage has to go around and around, and it would take like a long time to do this kind of thing, right? So this is a very important process that has to be done continually. Now, other health implications, very quickly, is that it also have other implications, especially when the woman is older. When you're young, you can manage. If you want to know what that feel like, it's just imagine wearing high heels, like really, really high heels, walking around and, basically never taking it off, right? I mean, if you have to go to a party and wear heels, it's bad enough for one night, right? Much just go on in your whole life and try to have this. And in long-term perspective, they begin to have issues, all right? Leg issues, hip issues, back issues, and so on. And especially for the elderly, sometimes they lose balance and fall because you have a very small base to walk. So a lot of the older women would complain that, they often fall because of their small feet and so on. Now, according to a study in 2014, White estimates that about 10% of all women with bound feet died from complications. Can you imagine that? 10% out of 2 billion in history, that's a lot of people who died from the complications. So you put that into perspective, that's like, we're talking about like millions of people who died for this practice. Now, is this worth it? Now, let's get into the discussion part, okay? And let's try to make sense out of this. We will have a quick discussion here to talk about, what makes it so appealing? What is the motivation behind this practice? Why would people spend years to force their feet into a certain shape so that it can fit into a certain Lotus shoes? Is it vanity? All right. Now, it's very hard for us looking back to understand this kind of thing. Why was foot binding so appealing? Well, first of all, some would suggest that it's because of the aesthetics and sex appeal. Women with bound feet is deemed as soft and dainty. And this is a virtue that for many Chinese, they associate that with the feminine. Now, keep in mind that the yin and yang concept, right, is very strong in China, and you have this, two sides, right? You have the yin and the yang. The yin is supposed to be the feminine, the soft. On the other side, you have the yang, the male, it's supposed to be the opposite of the other. So somehow the men would consider the women to be feminine is to have dainty features, and how a woman walks is very critical. Now, how a woman walks with bound feet is seen to accentuate her femininity and sex appeal. It's kind of like women today. I don't know. I don't know. Why do women wear heels? Right? We have to ask that question. Why can't you just go to a party with your party dress without heels? All right. I'm a guy, all right? So you can go figure. I beats me. Anyway, it has it is also believed in China that the way that a woman walk will well, this is kind of dirty, okay? A lot of these Chinese thinking, it's like it will strengthen certain muscles, right? And therefore will enhance the male sexual experience. That's why they want women to be like that. It's considered to be desirous. When you walk in this way long enough, then you'll develop certain muscles that will be great. Okay, so you can go figure, right? So this is considered to be one of the biggest themes. And when you read accounts of this, they would say, it's a men's thing. It's kind of like a fascination with this. Taking this further, another appeal is somewhat interpreted as sexual perversion. This is a form of foot fetish. It's kind of like a bound feet fetish. To be able to cram a distorted feet into a shoe of this size. Now, Hill writes in 2014 that the bound feet is considered to be the ultimate erogenous zone and never to be exposed or revealed during the Qing period. Now, remember, the Qing period is supposed to be the high time, the apex of this practice. And during this time, women can be naked, but they never show their feet. Right? This is something that they never do because it's considered to be the most intimate part of their body. So this is a cultural phenomenon that is developed over time, and somehow this culture developed to be as such. According to an earlier scholar, 1961, he asserts that the bound feet is considered to be the most intimate part of the woman's body. He also points out that in certain Qing era sex manuals, now there's a whole culture of this in China. Chinese erotica is, every culture has this, okay? And, they have in this particular, according to Van Gulik, a Dutch writer, he says that, according to the Qing sex manual, that illustrates 48 ways of playing with a woman's bound feet. Okay, so you can go figure what that means. So they have their own kind of culture that is associated with this erotica, this whole notion of the foot fetish. Right? So this is another way. It's, again, very men-centric. And you also have another reason. Okay, this is a more pragmatic one. It has to do with the social signification and implications. For many people, it is seen as a requirement for marriage because somehow this is a symbol of refinement. If a woman is dainty, if a woman is able to have this kind of thing, she will be considered to be more refined, more soft, more, not very harsh in her attitudes and everything else, and so forth. So this is, in a way, a social obligation. A lot of girls will be threatened. Says, if you don't go through this process, you'll never get married. Nobody wants to marry you. And for the Chinese, that's a very serious thing because marriage is always in the horizons for the women. All right, so this is a very different time, very different way of looking at things. So this is definitely one of these things. It is also a means of social mobility. For the person to move up in society and to improve their status, this is their way out, especially for the poor. That is why this is something that became very attractive for the rural sectors and for them to be able to do this kind of thing. They would, invest in one child. So somehow, increasing the chance of that child to move up. And in a sense, it would benefit the family and sometimes the entire clan. So this is something that they would go to great lengths in order to do, to improve themselves. And also, this is a symbol of prestige. For many families, if their child has this is considered to be a very, very beautiful thing. It's considered to be a very prestigious thing to have your child do that. Kind of like today, you have people, who graduate from college and having degrees and so on. I have 3 kids, went to Harvard and so forth. And it's not like a bragging thing. For them back then, it was kind of like that. And for the clan as well. Sometimes in a rural area, a clan or a village, if you have one person, it would kind of put them on the map in a sense. So you have a lot of social pressure forcing these women and the families to engage in this practice. Then you also have this theory, some people were suggesting that it also empowers the identity of the Han Chinese. right? So since this is a uniquely Han practice in history, it became something that affirms their sense of Chineseness, to kind of set them apart from the barbarians, if you will, the non-Han people. So they would go to great lengths in order to do this. Some would even assert that this is a symbol of women asserting their own identity. But in recent times, this is kind of like controversial because some would disagree with this idea. Are we really interjecting our 20th century feminist agendas into the past? Okay, so this is questioned. So this is kind of still up there somewhere. Now, why was foot binding appealing? Well, for some people, they want to continue to preserve the domesticity of women. So basically, again, this is tied in with this idea of the rich keeping their women confined to the place of the home, right? So somehow they want to keep the women within the home to set them apart from the poor who has to do manual labor. And these writers have suggested that their work at home can be done in a more refined way. So in other words, instead of doing like all the heavy lifting, doing the farm work, doing the planting and so forth, you can do handicrafts at home. You can kind of knit things. You don't need to walk around to do that. So to kind of keep them within the confines of the home, right? So they would also suggest that this practice of foot binding died out when industrialization came to China. And somehow they have a point because, they start practicing because there's no need for these fine handicrafts anymore when the industries came in. So there's a lot of theories regarding this idea as to why people did this and the motivations behind this. The answer may be sensual, sexual, it can be male orientation, it can be economic. There's so many different possibilities to look at this type of practice. Now, before I end, I'd just like to kind of quickly go and talk about this question. Why did the Lotus feet tradition thrive in China for so long? Why did the Chinese society, put up with this, right? I think it has a lot to do with the idea that, China was very much influenced by the Confucian idea. All right, the Confucianism in China goes a long way back, and their emphasis on social harmony is one of the big teachings of Confucianism, and especially in terms of the harmony in society, and this is one of the biggest contributions in a way of Confucianism. But in a sense, along with the benefits, you also have areas where society and culture become stagnant in a sense. So one of the ways in how society, according to Confucius, is supposed to be kept in order and to not fall in a sense, is to have a certain degree of homeostasis or harmony. And this is attributed in his way through the five relationship. So when you have the relationship between the king and the people, between siblings, between husband and wife, and between friends, it all starts there in a micro level. And once established rules are set and certain proprietary rituals are conducted to keep the norm of things, then everything will fall into place. So according to this way of thinking, they say harmony between the husband and the wife is very, very crucial. You don't want to rock the boat there, because once one thing is out of line, if the woman becomes over demand, then it's going to have chaos in society. And somehow, everything will eventually factor into the state. So it starts in the home, right? So somehow they wanted to keep this standard of the place of men and women confined to certain domains in order to protect this harmony and to keep this social order, right? So because of this, China has predominantly, for most of its history, been a male-dominant society. And we can see this very obviously by the fact that there are patrilineal, dominance in how they do things. For instance, you go to ancestral halls in China, you see the names of the men. You don't see women's names there, and the lineage is passed on through the men. Whereas the women is not necessarily inferior in a sense, but their domain and their function is more internals and within the home, right? Hence, there are a certain degree of expectation in roles, in gender roles, in how a man and a woman should act and should be. So for the men, obviously, they kind of have their own thing and kind of like a double standard from our perspective today. But this is the norm of that time, and hence the continuity of this idea of the men-dominated society is really something that keeps this practice in place for so long. Along with this idea comes with the primacy of the elder over the young. You know, as a Chinese, I'm sure you experience this in the home. You have to listen to the parents. The parents are always right. You know, this whole notion that you can't question them. You know, they know better than you. They've been around for a long time. They ate more rice than you, right? That's what they always say. So they would tell you, hey, don't question me. You know, take it back 100 years, 150 years. Imagine how much more intensified that culture was. And imagine a girl refusing to get her foot bound. That's not going to happen. So this is the culture where you have filial piety. You have to respect the elders. The kids are encouraged not to express their opinion. You don't have a voice. And because of this, you know, you also have a very fixed social organization. You know, people don't move up and down so quickly. Once you're in this place, you're here. You can fall, but it's very hard for you to go up. So in a typical class structure, you're pretty much confined to that level. Right? Now, we don't have a lot of time to go into this social organization thing, but again, these are different factors that continues to keep this tradition intact for so long. Right? So I'd like to end my session. I went over time. I went a little longer than expected. So we're witnessing the end of an era. Okay, so at this time, we like to reveal your polls and to see the question. Now, as for me, I like to add that, you know, I was able to have my great grandma, you know, she didn't really have the tiniest feet, but she had small feet. Okay, she undergone through this process, but I guess she's no golden lotus. she didn't make the golden lotus standard. She's at least 5 inches. But anyway, here's a picture of my mom and my great grandma who passed away in 1969. Okay, so anyway, I knew somebody. I had a relative with this. So we like to hear from you at this time.
All right, so here are the image references and other references that our wonderful speaker has used for today. Thank you so much, Dr. Young. You've truly piqued our interest, and I know there are a lot of viewers today who have gained much cultural knowledge from this as well. So yes, before we go into the questions and the poll results, we're giving them some time to prepare for that. I'd like to give a short recap of Dr. Young's wonderful presentation. So yes, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Young. Just for all the people who, in case they missed it. So having small feet was like the latest fashion during those times, and it also symbolized elegance and modesty. The process of binding back then is also shows a girl's status because the rich do not have to work long hours in the field and can just rest at home. Although it may seem strange to the modern generation as to why people would bound their feet, it is because of societal pressure and class notions that push countless Chinese women to bind their feet in pursuit of that dainty movement. So now, I'm sure not a lot of people have seen bound feet, and I'm sure not a lot of us have actually seen this in person. So yes, I'm actually very curious about the poll results. So here they are. Survey says that 28% of our viewers have had ancestors who've had bound feet. 48% rather said that they do not, and 24% said maybe. So there you go.
All right, very interesting to hear that, right?
Yeah, it's actually when I was listening to everything, especially the process of the foot binding, my feet went like this. I felt like, oh my. I cannot imagine
Right.
how the Chinese women during this time suffered because of this. And actually, we have a lot of questions out here right now. Are you ready to answer them?
Sure.
All right. So this is the very, very first one. It was very, very early. Did you think that the influence of it had some influence on the contemporary female fashion of wearing high heels?
Well, I don't know if there are any correlation between the heels that we have, but I'm not a researcher in fashion, okay? But I would imagine that this is something that can independently be innovated. I think you don't really need to see the Chinese to know that certain elevations will create certain illusions of beauty. Okay, and I think that it's not necessarily the case, but it can be. Now, the Westerners were able to see this practice for the first time, I think, during the 1800s, or maybe as far back as the 1700s, late 1700s. And I think the initial impression of this was shock, it was repulsion. So I don't know if that had any bearing on how they would construct the Western notion of beauty in terms of certain elevations and so forth. I would guess, venture to guess, that it was more of an independent innovation.
All right. Thank you for that wonderful answer. I truly do agree, and I think it's very similar to the phenomenon of like high heels and foot binding, very similar to like following the standards of beauty. So yes, it really resonates well with me, this topic. We have another question here. I think it's something I'm also very concerned with. Were there any cases of early death among girls who were involved in this foot binding process?
Yes, very possibly, because the possibility of infection is very high. Now, keep in mind that during those early days, they didn't have penicillin wasn't invented yet, and they didn't have any kind of antibiotic or any kind of treatments like that. They do have traditional Chinese medicine that perhaps may have antimicrobial or antiviral properties, but the risk is always there for blood poisoning, for sepsis to set in. So we don't have the actual statistics for that, but I would venture to guess, yes, very, very probable.
Yeah, I can feel it.
Yeah, especially if they say 10% died. Okay, that's a lot of people.
Oh my, yes. To add to this, our wonderful speaker yesterday, Mr. Gilbert Ke, actually is going to ask something to you also. He said, "Hi, sir. Would you happen to know how footbound women were able to survive long-distance travels during the early 1900s? We know that there was a wave of migration in the early 20th century due to events in China at the time." And he says that his footbound great-grandmother was one of those that immigrated from China to the Philippines around that time. So we'd like to ask, how did they, go around?
Yeah, I guess it would be very, very difficult to do that because obviously, if you have a very tiny feet, you're not destined to go run in a track and field or something like that, right? Or expected to go work out in the farm or something like that. So that would, I would imagine that would be very, very difficult. Usually, the people with this kind of bound feet are usually, for the most part, from the upper class. So given the fact that they might have resources for them to make certain arrangements in order to transport these people, but I can understand this becomes a very difficult thing during times of upheaval and war, where people have to literally flee for their lives. And I would imagine that many people lose their lives or have a very difficult time trying to escape.
Okay. Someone is also asking if like the Koreans or the Japanese probably did something similar. Do you have any idea if they had like a similar practice to this?
I didn't really come across any of this in my readings. It's more of a Han Chinese thing, but There might be some. I have to look into that. I cannot say for sure whether the Korean or the Japanese practice this tradition.
All right. Personally, I like to ask, like, can you describe how women during this time actually walked? Because, like, I'm very curious. It's like, is it like that?
Okay, imagine yourself putting all your toes, bending it down as far as you can fold it. All right? Like a club, like this. Your toes are like pushed in like this, and then your heels are like this. All right? Bunched up as tight as you can. All right, try to walk.
Oh
You're
my.
walking on your knuckles.
Oh, that must have hurt. Oh, I think this could be
Okay?
like, I can imagine something like ballet. Actually, that's a question here. Like, do you think it has like any influence on ballet dancing at all? Because like it's so compressed.
I don't know. I don't think so. I think ballet is more of a Western innovation. Again, the principle in ballet, the idea of the lift and standing in certain positions, again, it accentuates certain features. You see this in different dances where the performer will have to stand as a certain position. I would imagine that that would be an independent innovation.
I see, I see. It's really quite interesting though to see how all of these are coinciding together. They have very much lots of similarities, but they come from very different origins, from very different cultures. So it's very, very fascinating for me. And I think, you did a really, really good job, telling us about this whole thing. So for our last question for today, won't it look unappealing if there was an extreme disproportionality between the woman's body and the women's feet?
It would look weird. Okay, I can imagine that if a woman is a little bit more on the corpulent side and having this feature with the dainty feet, it would be very difficult for her to, physically, to not only to support her weight, but also in terms of appearance. But then again, that kind of thing is not a very common attribute during this time. We don't see a lot of this obesity taking place there during that time. It's more. I think it's more of a modern phenomenon, right? So yeah, of course, it would not be well, but somehow this is still desired. It's something that people go to extraordinary lengths in order to achieve.
All right. All right, I think that is the last question for today. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer all of these questions. So if you have any final remarks for our wonderful viewers for today, Dr. Stuart Young.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I would like to wish all of you a happy Chinese New Year coming up, and I'm sure you're going to celebrate this, and it's going to be a very fun time. So, yeah, take care, stay safe, and God bless you all.
All right, thank you. All right, guys, I'm sure you enjoyed that. And before we really end this program, I just want to take this opportunity to say that I love the events that have been held by both the Ateneo Celadon and the Ateneo Ricardo Leong Center for Chinese Studies. They've really done a marvelous job at attempting to spread cultural awareness and appreciation towards both fellow Filipino and Chinese people alike. Once again, thank you everyone for attending the session today, and we hope that you have learned something new. We hope to see you at our last webinar session tomorrow at 2 p.m., which will be about Chinese landscape painting. So thank you for joining us as we celebrate our culture, our story, and our spring festival. Again, I am Alicia Bakiran from 2BX Management Honors, your host for today. Many thanks, and I hope that you all have a wonderful day ahead.